Welcome back to Face the Nation. I'm Margaret Brennan. We are just over 5 months away from the midterm elections, and today we are kicking off our Battleground Tracker poll with the CBS News Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto. Anthony, good to have you here. Typically, the party in control of the White House often loses some seats with these congressional races. The Democrats seem to be banking on a blue wave to retake control. Is it that clear cut?
It is not that clear cut. We think today, if the election were held, House control would be a toss-up. The Democrats are poised to gain seats. You're right about that. They're the out party. Typically, the out party does get some seats. We think they would get enough to just barely take the majority. We estimate they'd get 219 seats. It takes 218 to control the House. So it's that close. What we do think is that as we go along, we're going to see this go back and forth. We think that the House could come down to just a handful of districts, and that's going to be really exciting to watch.
And as you say, those districts in particular are going to make it even more exciting because they're not clear Trump supporters, they're not clear Democrats. They're suburban and they tend to be fairly well off.
Right. See, here's how we know this. The House, of course, is a race for 435 districts. They're all up. But the bulk of them never change parties. Incumbents get reelected, partisans stay with their preferred party. So all of this really comes down to a relatively smaller number of districts that are competitive, where both parties have good candidates, where the voters are more evenly divided. And that's how we know this. What we've done here is we've taken a sample in our surveys heavily concentrated in these districts. We think there are about 50 to 60 of them that are going to determine control. These are the swing districts. So as we look really hard at those places and we start to follow them, they're coast to coast. They're in Republican pockets of blue states like New Jersey or California, even Texas, some. They are heavily suburban, as you mentioned, and they're the places where there's not necessarily a concentration of Trump voters and there's not necessarily a part of the Democratic base, and that's a big part of what puts them in play.
Now, establishment Republicans in particular want to run on the economy, and certainly the president gave them what he's crediting as a very strong jobs number, and you do see unemployment rates for Hispanics and African Americans at multi-decade lows. How does that change the race?
Well, the good economy is clearly part of the wind at the backs of Republicans. It's one of the things we think in the survey could help them hang on to their majority, even if narrowly, because voters across these districts say that the economy is good. And that is true of both Republicans and Democrats and independents. Clearly a plus for the Republicans. But there's a bit of what you might call a payoff problem for this Republican Congress in that when we ask about some of the things that the Congress has done, including economic things like the tax cut, like changes to health care, most voters say that they haven't yet felt the effects of those things, not the positive effects, not even negatively, they just aren't there. So, you start to see the Republicans probably needing to make an argument going forward that these things have helped people, because that, at least in the surveys, doesn't seem to be resonating just yet.
So when the White House talks about making more tweaks to tax policy, that might be something to help out some of those Republicans. The Democrats, though, by all accounts, are energized. Does that make a difference?
Yeah, coming off a year in which they did well in a lot of these special elections, a lot of Democrats have been hopeful that they can kind of scale up that enthusiasm, let it carry over those 435 districts. Even in this survey, we see the Democrats heavily dependent on turning out voters who don't typically vote in midterms. I really can't stress that enough. Even as we watch the polling going forward, you're going to see a lot of folks who tell us that they're going to vote in the midterms, but they don't profile as though they normally do. Often midterm turnout is lower than it is in the presidential. Democrats have to change that equation. Right now, Democrats say that they are doing it. They say they're enthusiastic. They say that this midterm vote is as important as their presidential vote. That's an important part to watch going forward. We'll see if they can sustain it, though, over 6 months.
Because that's always the question, right? The president himself is not on the ballot. Is this actually sort of a referendum on him and what he's delivered?
Yeah, in congressional elections, we usually see a majority of people saying that they feel their vote is either to support or oppose the president. It's no different here. Half of the folks voting for Democrats say that they're doing it to oppose the administration. But is that enough? Is that going to be enough? Because we also see that people say they're not quite clear on what the Democrats would do if they got elected, if they got the House majority. So that's part of the argument that it looks like the Democrats still need to make if they're going to get even more seats and sort of go even more comfortably into a position where they could take control.
And of course, Steve Bannon, who was very successful in advising the president back in 2016, is urging Republicans to run on immigration, not necessarily the economy.
Yeah.
Is that a good strategy?
Well, look, when we talk to Republicans in these districts, they want to hear about immigration. They say that they feel like immigration has changed their local area and not for the better. It's one of their top issues, if not the top issue, and it's something that sort of unites the base.
As a security issue or as an employment issue?
It's actually both. It's very much both. They are concerned about security, but they've also been, in recent polling, also concerned about immigrants taking low-wage jobs. Now, the difference, though, is that in a lot of these districts, folks say that jobs are still at least a minor problem. And, if you look back to the idea that the economy is still good, the larger question to watch is, do the Republicans run on this sort of larger, hey, everything's good, the economy's good message? Or if you're talking about immigration, you're kind of saying, well, there's still problems that need to be fixed because it hasn't, the problem really hasn't been solved. Well, which is it, right? Which in the larger sense, is it everything's good or there's still problems? That's one of the key things to watch as they go forward.
You heard former House Speaker John Boehner say earlier that there's no Republican Party anymore. It's Trump's party. Republicans are taking a nap somewhere. How on the money is he with that?
Well, in terms of candidates for Congress, 3/4 of Republicans say that they want their House candidates to be somebody in line with Donald Trump. And that's as opposed to when we ask them if they'd want a candidate who's more independent from Donald Trump. So to that extent, it does appear to be the president's party.
Well, obviously, Republican leaders in the House and Senate can't like hearing the criticism, but for Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, how concerned does he need to be on his side of the Capitol about losing some seats?
Only somewhat, but not very, because the map really favors the Republicans going in. Here's what I mean. When we look at the third of the Senate that's up for election this cycle, most of them are Democrats, and there's a lot of Democratic senators who are trying to hang on in states that are traditionally Republican, that are red states, right? And that's particularly true across the Midwest, from Missouri to Indiana to North Dakota. When you look at that and you think in this hyper-partisan environment where Republicans vote for Republicans and Democrats for Democrats, these senators have to worry that that's what's going to happen to them, that because there's more Republicans in these states, that they'll get swept out. The difference, and what we'll watch through the year, is whether or not these red state Democrats can make it about local issues, can make it about them and their candidacy, as opposed to that national partisanship. But overall, on balance, the map favors the Republicans.
We'll be hearing from you, Anthony, quite a lot as we head towards the fall. Thank you very much.
Should be fun. Thanks.
We'll be right back. We'll talk about a lot of these issues with our political panel. We'd like to welcome our panel now for some political analysis. David Nakamura covers the White House for The Washington Post. Susan Page is the Washington bureau chief at USA Today. Michael Crowley is the senior foreign affairs correspondent at Politico. And Ed O'Keefe is CBS's own political correspondent. Susan, let's start off with you. The New York Times yesterday got this 20-page memo from the president's attorneys laying out some of what their justification is, basically saying that the president can't legally be compelled to testify, and nor can he be guilty of obstruction of justice. Some are reading this as the president saying he's above the law. How should we understand this?
It's a pretty brash memo. We have a tradition of a powerful presidency. We do not have a tradition of an all-powerful presidency. And in fact, the genius of the founders was the system of checks and balances that we have. I don't know if the courts would uphold the view that the lawyers outline in this memo, but I do think even if they did, the final question will come down to a political one. It will come down to a question of impeachment, and that is what the White House is also focused on. Not only the legal questions involved here about whether you can keep the president from being forced to testify, but the political ones of whether you can make it less likely that he would be impeached regardless of what happens with the Russia investigation.
And Susan just said this is going to be a political question. You heard Congressman Hurd say it would be a problem, some of these things, particularly on the pardon front, if the president tried to do that to himself, something the president's attorney said unthinkable, but he probably has the power to do it.
He does, and it's as if this week he finally realized that this is one of those things he can do. and in essence do whatever he wants with. The fact that he met with Kim Kardashian, the reality TV star, he last week pardoned Jack Johnson, the boxer, but only after Sylvester Stallone got involved. And I think, there's some concern here in town that this is a signal perhaps to, the folks that are under a legal cloud right now that, hey, if you ride this out, I'll take care of you on the back end. But Will Hurd said it's a potential issue. The House Majority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, this morning also said he shouldn't go too far and certainly not consider pardoning himself were it ever to come to that.
The former Attorney General, Eric Holder, who served under the Obama administration, said he laid out that he thinks this is clearly the president trying to send a message to some of his allies that don't worry too much. You'll have a pardon coming your way.
Sure, you look at these pardons just from this past week, but also the pardon of Scooter Libby. I mean, these are big, bold moves that the president seems to be taking that are outside what had been established in the last couple presidencies as a process by which these things look less politicized. And the president, whether it's a direct signal or not, he's saying, I'm not bound by convention once again. I'm willing to take the heat on something like this. And that's very clear, not just to maybe the people in this probe, but others who are around the president who may be dragged into this who down the line.
Some may look at this, though, and the cast of characters, the possible pardon for Martha Stewart, the pardon of Dinesh D'Souza. Are we overreading this? Is it just randomness?
Well, no, it's also very political. I mean, these are people who support the president, who have attacked Barack Obama. So the president, it's about his politics. And so a system that had been politicized in the past, that previous presidents, most recent presidents had tried to make less politicized, this president's jumping right in and saying, I don't mind that. I relish a fight. I relish the backlash almost. We've seen that with his culture wars and all sorts of other decisions.
It also speaks to his personality, this kind of fiat power he has. You are pardoned. I am the supreme authority in the country. I don't care about how this was done in the past. I mean, it's very Trumpian. It's almost out of a reality show. The opposite of you're fired, you're pardoned. He loves having that almost kind of magical power and exercising it without anyone in Congress able to stop him.
Well, I want to ask you, Michael, the president's also going to Canada this week at a time when this may not be so welcome, given the tariffs he just put in place. Yeah. You heard the Canadian Prime Minister come out and say this is not only deeply insulting, it's hurtful and it's damaging ultimately. What is the approach here? Is this just about gaining leverage for NAFTA?
Well, I think that's part of it. It may also be partly politics, that Trump, as the midterms approach, and Trump is thinking about his reelection, he wants to show his base that he is taking clear, tangible actions to stand up for American industry against these foreign companies. As we all know, core theme of his 2016 campaign was that America is getting ripped off, both economically and diplomatically. So this is a way for him to follow through on that promise. And I do think if you look at Trump's record, going all the way back to the 1980s when he started talking about national politics, he does think America is being ripped off. Now, loads of economists and leading political figures think that he doesn't really understand how these things work. But I do think that this truly motivates him, this idea that we're getting taken for a ride. I do think that, and so he's going to be a skunk at the garden party up in Canada at the G7, and he's opening himself up to strong counterattacks. I thought John Kasich actually had a nice line where he said, it's not America first, it's America alone. That does seem to resonate, I think, with a lot of people.
Today, actually, you had the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haas, saying on Twitter that we'd gone from the G8 economies to putting Russia out for their bad behavior. Now it's a G7. He said it's now at the G6, and America is basically isolating itself. And I talked to a former Obama State Department official just yesterday for a story who pointed out that these tariffs came in on the same day that Trump is welcoming a top North Korea official to the White House and saying, I'm not going to use maximum pressure anymore. We're talking well. So was that timed on purpose or not? It looks bad to the allies. You're seeing not just Trudeau, but now finally Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe getting more angry with Trump.
But here's the risk. Republicans are terrified by it. The best thing Trump and the Republicans have going for them is this economy. Right. Yeah. 3.8% unemployment. That's a remarkable number that we got on Friday. And there's concern that getting into a trade war with Canada and Europe and Mexico is going to cost that remarkable economic recovery that we've seen. And that would be very bad for the White House, for the Republicans, and, by the way, for the country.
You know it's bad when the House Speaker puts out a statement that explicitly says, I disagree with this decision.
But didn't mention the president's name.
Didn't mention the president's name and hasn't issued those kinds of statements in the past when he has done or said other things. When other senators call it dumb, when others say they're going to try to persuade the White House to pull this back, they know it's a problem that could cost them big time in November.
Well, we have so much more to talk about on this front, but I do want to take a quick break here and come back in a moment with more insight from our political panel. Stay with us. We are back now with our panel, and I want to pick up on this big question of what's going to be happening with North Korea. You've got the Japanese Prime Minister coming to town, a summit there. You've just had the North Koreans visiting the White House. David, you've written a bit about the photo op, the propaganda that the North Koreans won this week. Why does that matter?
Well, you know, a lot of people say, look, a presidential summit should be a reward for steps taken before the summit. You've seen North Korea do some things like, shut down their nuclear testing, as you guys discussed earlier in the show. But some people are saying they have not really formally committed to some sort of clear denuclearization process, and Trump's jumping the gun. He's starting with the summit. So now you have him going to Singapore for something this president thinks a lot about, which is the public display and the show. And the president seemed very enamored with the images of Kim Jong-un and the South Korean President Moon holding hands and stepping back and forth across the DMZ line. So what is he thinking in terms of that? But people say, look, you can't go too far. You're America. This is, moments ago you were name-calling him. And so what are you going to do to sort of make clear that you're going to continue this tough, maximum pressure that you talked about and not go too far? North Korea used this kind of summit to try to say we're equal with the world's greatest power.
Well, Michael, I mean, the president's unpredictability, many would say, former Defense Secretary Robert Gates, who has been a critic of the president in the past, said unpredictability has been to his benefit here. And certainly just a week ago, the summit was off. Now it's back on. No more maximum pressure. The policy seems to be changing as we speak.
It does. It seems like the president is actually improvising this. And it's sort of hard to predict where it goes. But I think there is a school of thought that says that unpredictability frightened the North Koreans. It thought, man, the entire United States foreign policy establishment says you could never launch a first strike against North Korea, but this guy just might do it, so maybe we should start talking to him. The alternate theory is that this has nothing to do with that the North Koreans essentially got where they needed to be with their nuclear and missile programs and said, okay, we're ready to talk. And everything else was just noise, the tweeting and the bluster. On the one hand, what I think we saw from Trump, and David Storage was so good, talked about the photograph with Trump in the Oval Office with this North Korean envoy beaming as he got this enormous letter from North Korean leader, seemed very pleased by the size of the envelope. There is a sort of eagerness and enthusiasm that makes a lot of people nervous, that he wants this deal too badly. He wants to be seen as a peacemaker to shut up all these Democrats who have been saying he's going to start a nuclear war and end life on the earth as we know it. On the other hand, there was a note of realism, I thought, in his rhetoric where he said, look, we're probably not going to settle, not going to sell everything in one summit, and this may be the beginning of a process. It could take a long time, a process. Now,
that means something in diplomatic terms. That means I'm buying myself some wiggle room.
Right, and so a lot of people would say, well, duh, we've been saying this all along, but it does show that maybe some reality is creeping into his, what seemed like earlier belief that maybe you could snap your fingers and solve this problem. It's going to take years.
Ed, one of the problems the president continues to talk about, from his perception it's a problem, is immigration.
Yeah.
But yet you're seeing Republicans not want to move forward with a vote on this, at least Republican leadership.
Right.
As you heard Congressman Hurd say, he thinks they can force a vote this month.
So there's this procedural move in the House called a discharge petition that would essentially force the hand of Paul Ryan and compel them to hold votes on competing immigration proposals. Interesting that Hurd told you earlier that he thinks that will happen. The earliest it could happen, I believe, is June 25th. Our polling shows, that the Battleground polling out this morning, that immigration actually remains a top-of-mind concern. 51% of people want to hear a lot about it. It places it, I think, fourth among the issues. The problem is Democrats and Republicans want to hear different things about it. Mm-hmm. Democrats want to find a way to allow those dreamers to stay in the country legally, allow them to continue to contribute to society. Republicans are concerned that they're adversely affecting their communities, and they want to see tougher border security put in place, employment verification, and things like that. And I think it's just striking. Anthony mentioned it earlier. Nearly 2/3 of Republicans tell us that that with new immigrants coming into their communities, they believe it's adversely affecting them. That is why Ryan doesn't want this to happen. Because even if it passes the House with mostly Democratic votes, the president doesn't want it, the Senate doesn't want it, so you're creating a two-pronged problem. Conservatives will be upset that you allowed it at all and didn't do what they wanted, and then these moderate Republicans who are in the swing districts where they're going to lose this year are going to have to go home empty-handed and potentially lose their races. It's a huge headache for them, one they'd like to sort out, but they're not going to be able to, most likely, if recent history is any guide.
I want to get to I guess, for lack of a better term, a cultural moment this week, and one that the president had some thoughts on. The comedian Roseanne had some racist statements she made. Her employer at ABC fired her from the program she had that was very successful. Then you had another TV network issuing statements about a comedian who works there who had some four-letter words to refer to the first daughter. I mean, it seems like the rhetoric can't get any worse, David. But why is the president talking about it? Why does this matter?
Well, the president has shown that he does not shy away from these cultural fights. I mean, we also had the NFL change the rules on national anthems, something the president took credit for. I mean, so you had just a few weeks ago, we were here talking about the White House Correspondents' Dinner and the White House taking umbrage to all the offense. But when it came down to Roseanne's comments, did they jump in and say anything? No, they've used that as to say, hey, the president deserves an apology for all these other things that were said by liberals and liberal comedians. So, I think that this is a sense that it's not just Trump, but obviously our culture and social media, people saying their inside thoughts out loud. I mean, these things are happening almost on a weekly basis, these big flare-ups, and I think this is a president who somewhat, obviously pushes those buttons and enjoys talking about it.
What has struck me about this, though, is the increasing willingness and expectation that corporate America will step up on these cultural issues. That if ABC has a star who says these offensive things, they are expected to take action. Or if TBS does, or if Starbucks has a controversy that involves racial profiling at one of their stores, that they are expected to do something about that. I wonder if it's even because a feeling that Washington is no longer able to respond in real time to some of these cultural issues, that we now expect corporate America to do that.
Well, or it's fundamentally not so much a political issue, it's always a business decision.
I would just,
let me just ask you, Susan, on that, we were talking about the blue wave not being a tsunami. I know you had a conversation recently with former President Clinton.
I interviewed President Clinton and James Patterson. They have a thriller that comes out today, as a matter of fact. And I asked President Clinton if he thought there was a blue wave coming. He has some experience with waves since he lost control of the House and Senate in his first midterm election in 1994. He said a blue wave had been building, but he wasn't sure that it still was, that there were too many intervening narratives. And I think that includes this good economy and the prospect of what will look like a successful summit with North Korea, imperiling Democrats' expectation, the conventional wisdom that Democrats are going to win the House in November.
And that's what's so interesting to hear John Boehner also say there's no Republican Party. You've got that identity crisis on the Democratic side and the Republican side playing out here. Thank you for all of your insights. And we will be back in just a moment here on Face the Nation. Stay with us. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.